Hello and welcome. Today we're going to discuss 3 of the primary sources regarding the Black Death in Europe, told by those who were unfortunate enough to be there at the time. The first is one of Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived from 1317 to 1375, somewhat of a quintessential account in his work the Decameron. And so, let's begin. If you like this kind of content, like and subscribe, you know the drill. Nice and relaxed, shall we? The account of Giovanni Boccaccio from the Decameron. I say, then, that the years of the beatific incarnation of the Son of God had reached the tale of 1348, when in the illustrious city of Florence, the fairest of all the cities of Italy, there made its appearance that deadly pestilence, which, whether disseminated by the influence of the celestial bodies, or sent upon us mortals by God in his just wrath by way of retribution for our iniquities, had had its origins some years before in the East, whence, after destroying an innumerable multitude of living beings, it had propagated itself without respite from place to place, and so calamitously had spread into the West. In Florence, despite all that human wisdom and forethought could devise to avert it, as the cleansing of the city from many impurities by officials appointed for the purpose, the refusal of entrance to all sick folk, and the adoption of many precautions for the preservation of health, despite also humble supplications addressed to God, and often repeated both in public procession and otherwise by the devout, towards the beginning of the spring of the said year, the doleful effects of the pestilence began to be horribly apparent by symptoms that showed as if miraculous. Not such were they in the East, where an issue of blood from the nose was a manifest sign of inevitable death. But in men, a woman alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or the armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg, some more, some less, which the common folk called gaviccioli. From the 2 said pairs, the body, this deadly gaviccioli, soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots, or livid, making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, then minute and numerous. And, as the gaviccioli had been and still were infallible tokens of approaching death, such also were the spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. Which maladies seemed set entirely at naught both the art of the physician and the virtue of the physic. Indeed, whether it was that disorder was a nature to defy such treatment, or that the physicians were at fault. Besides the qualified, there was now a multitude of both men and of women who practiced without having received the slightest tincture of medical science, and being in ignorance of its source, failed to apply the proper remedies. In either case, not merely were those that covered few, but almost all within 3 days from the appearance of the said symptoms, sooner or later, died, and in most cases, without any fever or other attendant malady. Moreover, the virulence of the pest was the greater reason by the intercourse was apt to convey it from the sick to the whole, just as fire devours things dry or greasy. When they are brought close to it, the evil went yet further. For not merely by speech or association with the sick was that malady communicated to the healthy with consequent peril of common death, but any that touched the clothes of the sick, or aught else that had been touched, or used by these, seems thereby to contract the disease. So marvellous sounds, that which I have now to relate, that had not many, and I among them, observed it with their own eyes, I had hardly dared to credit it, much less to set it down in writing, though I had had it from the lips of credible witnesses. I say then, that such was the energy of the contagion of the said pestilence, that it was not merely propagated from man to male, but, what is much more startling, it was frequently observed that things which had belonged to one sick or dead of the disease, if touched by some other living creature, not of the human species, were the occasion not merely of sickening, but of almost instantaneous death, whereof my own eyes, as I said a little before, had cognizance, one day among others, by following the experience. The rags of a poor man who had died of the disease being strewn about the open street, 2 hogs came thither, and after, as is their wont, no little trifling with their snouts, took the rags between their teeth and tossed them to and fro about their chaps. Whereupon, almost immediately, they gave a few turns, and fell down dead, as if by poison, upon the rags which in an evil hour they had disturbed. In which circumstances, not to speak of many others of a similar or even greater complexion, divers apprehensions and imaginations were engendered in the minds of such as were left alive, inclining almost all of them to the same harsh resolution, to wit, to shun and abhor all contact with the sick and all that belonged to them, thinking thereby to make each his own health secure. Among whom there were those who thought that to live temperately and avoid all excesses would count for much as a preservative against seizures of this kind. Wherefore they banded together, and dissociating themselves from all others, formed communities in houses where they were no sick, and lived a separate and secluded life, which they regulated with utmost care, avoiding every kind of luxury, but eating and drinking moderately of the most delicate viands and the finest wines, holding converse with none but another, lest tidings of sickness or death should reach them, and diverting their minds with music and such other delights as they could devise. Others, the bias of whose minds was in the opposite direction, maintained that to drink freely, frequent places of public resort, and to take their pleasure with song and revel, sparingly to satisfy no appetite, and to laugh and mock at no event, was the sovereign remedy for such a great evil. And that which they affirmed they also put into practice, so far as they were able, resorting day and night, now to this tavern, now to that, drinking with an entire disregard of rule or measure, and by preference making the houses of others, as it were, their inns, if they but saw in them aught that particularly was to their taste or liking, which they were readily able to do, because the owners, seeing death imminent, had become as reckless of their property as of their lives, so that most of these houses were open to all comers, and no distinction was observed between the stranger who presented himself and the rightful lord. Thus, adhering ever to the inhuman determination to shun the sick as far as possible, they ordered their life. In this extremity of our city's suffering and tribulation, the venerable authority of laws human and divine was abased and all but totally dissolved for lack of those who should have administered and enforced them, most of whom, like the rest of the citizens, were either dead or sick, or so hard-bested for servants that they were unable to execute any office, whereby every man was free to do what was right in his own eyes. Not a few there who belonged to neither of the two said parties, but kept a middle course between them, neither laying the same restraint upon their diet as the former, nor allowing themselves the same license in drinking or other dissipations as the latter, but living with a degree of freedom sufficient to satisfy their appetite, and not as recluses. They therefore walked abroad, carrying in their hands flowers or fragrant herbs or divers sorts of spices which they frequently raised to their noses, deeming it an excellent thing thus to comfort the brain with such scents and perfumes, because the air seemed everywhere laden with the reeking stench emitted by the dead and dying, the odors of drug. But some, again, the most sound perhaps in judgment, as they were also the most harsh in temper of all, affirmed that there was no medicine for the disease superior or equal ineffective to flight. Following which prescription, a multitude of men and women, negligent of all but themselves, deserted their cities, the houses, their estates, their kinsfolk, everything they had, and thus went into voluntary exile, or migrated to the country parts as if God, visiting men with this pestilence in requital of their iniquities, would not pursue them with his wrath, wherever they might be, but intending the destruction of such alone as remained within the circuit of the walls of the city, or deeming, perchance, that it was now time for all to flee from it, and that its last hour had come. Of the adherents of all these diverse opinions not all died, neither did all escape, but rather there were each sort in every place many that sickened, and by those who retained their health were treated after the example which they themselves while whole had set, being everywhere left to languish in almost total neglect. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbors was scarce found that any showed fellow feeling for each other, how kinsfolk held aloof, and never met, or but rarely, enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women, that in the aura, therefore, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by nephew, brother by sister, uncle by aunt, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been complete strangers, whereof the sick both sexes, whose number could not be estimated, were left without resource but in the charity of friends, and few such there were, or the interest of servants, who were hardly to be had at high rates and on unseemly terms, and being moreover one and all men and women of gross understanding, and for the most part unused to such offences, concerned themselves no further than to supply the immediate and expressed wants of the sick, and to watch them all die, in which service they themselves not seldom perished with their gains. In consequence of which dearth of servants and dereliction of the sick by the neighbours, kinsfolk, and friends, it came to pass a thing, perhaps, never before heard of, that no woman, however dainty, however fair, or however well born she might be, shrank, when stricken with disease, from the ministrations of a man, no matter whether he were young or not, or scrupled to expose to him every part of her body, with no more shame than if he had been a woman, submitting to necessity of that which the malady required, wherefrom, perchance, there resulted in after some time some loss of modesty in such as recovered. Besides which many succumbed, who with proper attendance would perhaps have escaped death, so that, with the virulence of the plague and the lack of due attendance to the sick, the multitude of deaths that daily and nightly took place in the city was such that those who heard the tale, not to say witnessed the fact, that were struck dumb with amazement, whereby practices contrary to the former habits of the citizens could hardly fail to grow up among the survivors. It had been, as to this day it still is, for the women that were neighbours and of kin to the deceased to gather in his house, with the women that were most closely connected to him, to wail with them in common, while on the other hand his male kinsfolk and neighbours, with not a few of the other citizens and a due proportion of the clergy according to his quantity, assembled without, in front of his house, to receive the corpse, and so the dead man was borne on the shoulders of his peers, with funeral pomp and tapper and dirge, to the church selected by him before his death, which rites, as the pestilence waxed in fury, were either in whole or in great part discussed, and gave way to others of a novel order. For not only did no crowd of women surround the bed of the dying, but many passed from this life unregarded, and few indeed were they to whom were accorded the lamentations and bitter tears of sorrowing relations. Nay, for the most part, their place was taken by the laugh, the jest, the festal gathering, observances which the woman domestic piety in large measure set aside, had adopted with very great advantage to their health. Few also were there whose bodies were attended to the church by more than 10 or 12 of their neighbours, and those not the honourable and respected citizens, but a sort of corpse carrier drawn from the baser ranks, who called themselves Beccini, and performed such offices for hire, would shoulder the bearing, and with hurried steps carry it, not to the church of the dead man's choice, but to that which was nearest at hand, where 4 or 6 priests in front of a candle or 2, perhaps none, nor did the priests distress themselves with too long and solemn an office, but with the aid of the Beccini, hastily consigned the corpse to the first tomb which they found unattended. The condition of the lower, and perhaps in great measure of the middle ranks of the people, showed even worse and more deplorable, for, deluded by hope and constrained by poverty, they stayed in their quarters, in their houses, where they sickened by thousands a day, and, being without service or help of any kind, were, so to speak, irredeemably devoted to the death which overtook them. Many died daily or nightly in the public streets, and many others who died at home, their departure was hardly observed by their neighbors, until the stench of their putrefying bodies carried the tidings. And what with their corpses, and the corpses of others who died on every hand, the whole place was a sepulchre. It was the common practice of most neighbors, moved no less by fear of contamination by the putrefying bodies than by charity towards the deceased, to drag corpses out of the houses with their own hands, aided perhaps by a porter, if a porter was to be had, and to lay them in front of the doors, where anyone who made the round might have been seen, especially in the morning, more of them than he could count. Afterwards, there would have been biers brought up to or in default planks where they laid them upon. Nor was it once, twice, that one on the same bier carried 2 or 3 corpses at once, but quite a considerable number of such cases occurred. 1 bier sufficing for husband and wife, 2 or 3 brothers, father and son, and so forth. And times without number it happened that as 2 priests bearing the cross were on their way to perform the last office for some time, 3 or 4 biers were brought up by the porters in the rear of them, so that whereas the priests supposed that they had but 1 corpse to bury, they discovered that there were 6 or 8, or sometimes even more. Nor for all their number were their obsequies honored by either tears or lights or crowds of mourners. Rather, it was come to this, that a dead man was then of no more account than a dead goat would be of today. End of the account from Giovanni Boccaccio, from the work The Decameron. Pretty scary, huh? Well, some of the language is a little bit dated, I'm sure, but we really should remain faithful to the source material. Now, let's move on, as we have another account. And this one is a little short, but it's interesting. It is from the great traveler Ibn Battuta. If you've not heard of him, I've done a full video on him. Quite fascinating. Pretty much walked for a very, very long time, if we want to boil it down to that. Now, he was around in 1348 in Damascus, which of course at the time, with crusades going on and all the rest, was always fought over back and forth between the Eastern powers and the Western powers, or we could just say the Christians and the Muslims, with the occasional Mongol interference. Well, we're lucky enough that we still have his account, as he kept quite an extensive journal, and this is what he wrote about experiencing the scenes of the plague in 1348 in that city of Damascus, modern-day Syria. One of these celebrated sanctuaries at Damascus is the Mosque of the Footprints, Al-Akhdam, which lies 2 miles south of the city, alongside the main highway which leads to the Hijaz, Jerusalem, and Egypt. It is a very large mosque, very blessed, richly endowed, and very highly venerated by the Damascines. The footprints from which it derives its name are certain footprints impressed upon a rock there, which are said to be those marking Moses's feet. In this mosque there is a small chamber containing a stone with the following inscription: "A certain pious man saw in his sleep the chosen one Muhammad, who said to him, 'Here is the grave of my brother Moses.'" I saw a remarkable instance of veneration in which the Damascines hold this mosque during the great pestilence on my return journey through Damascus in the latter part of July 1348. The Viceroy Argun Shah ordered a crier to proclaim through Damascus that all people should fast for 3 days, and that no one should cook anything edible in the market during the daytime. For most of all people, there eat no food, but what had been prepared in the market. So the people fasted for 3 successive days, the last of which was a Thursday. Then they assembled in the great mosques, amirs, sharifs, qadis, theologians, and all other classes of people, until the place was filled to overflowing, and there they spent the Thursday night in prayers and litanies. After the dawn prayer the next morning, they all went out together on foot, holding Korans in their hands, and the amirs barefooted. The procession was joined by the entire population of the town, men and women, small and large. The Jews came with their book of the law and the Christians with their gospel, all of them with their women and children. The whole concourse, weeping and supplicating, and seeking the favor of God through his book of prophets, made their way to the mosque at the footprints, where they remained in supplication and in invocation until near midday. They then returned to the city and held the Friday service, and God lightened their affliction, for the number of deaths in a single day at Damascus did not attain 2,000, while in Cairo and Old Cairo it reached the figure of 24,000 a day. End of the account from Ibn Battuta. What'd you think of that one? Well, we've got another one for you, and this time we go back to Florence, back to Italy. It's a little bit of a later account, kind of a retrospect from one Marchione di Coppo Stefani in a work called the Florentine Chronicle, which was written around the 1370s. So let's begin. In the year of our Lord, 1348, there was a very great pestilence in the city and district of Florence. It was of such a fury, and so tempestuous, that in houses in which it took hold, previously healthy servants who took care of the ill died of the same illness. Almost none of the ill survived past the 4th day. Neither physicians nor medicines were effective, whether because these illnesses were previously unknown or because physicians had not previously studied them. There seemed to be no cure. There was such a fear that no one seemed to know what to do. When it took hold in a house, it often happened that no one remained who had not died. And it was not just that men and women died, but even sentient animals died. Dogs, cats, chickens, oxen, donkeys, sheep showed the same symptoms and died of the same disease. And almost none, or very few who showed the symptoms, were cured. The symptoms were the following: a bubo in the groin, where the thigh meets the trunk, or a small swelling under the armpit, sudden fever, spitting blood and saliva, and no one who spat blood survived it. It was such a frightful thing that when it got into a house, as was said, no one remained. Frightened people abandoned the house and fled to another. Those in town fled to villages. Physicians could not be found, because they had died like the others. And those who could be found wanted vast sums in hand before they entered the house. And when they did enter, they checked the pulse with face turned away. They inspected the urine from a distance, and with something odoriferous under their nose. Child abandoned father. Husband abandoned wife. Wife the husband. One brother the other. One sister the other. In all the city, there was nothing to do but to carry the dead to burial, and those who died had neither confessor nor sacraments, and many died with no one looking after them, and many died of hunger, because when someone took to bed sick, another in the house, terrified, said to him, "I'm going for the doctor." Calmly walking out the door, the other left and never returned. Abandoned by the people, without food, but accompanied by fever, they weakened. There were many who pleaded with their relatives not to abandon them when night fell, but the relatives said to the sick person, "So that during the night you did not have to awaken those who serve you and who work hard day and night, take some sweetmeats, wine or water. They are here on the bedstead by your head. Here are some blankets." And when the sick person had fallen asleep, they left, and they did not come back. If it happened that he was strengthened by the food during the night, he might be alive and strong enough to get to the window. If the street was not a major one, he might stand there a half-hour before anyone came by. And if someone did pass by, if he was strong enough that he could be heard when he called out to them, sometimes there might be a response, and sometimes not. But there was no help. No one, or few, wished to enter a house where anyone was sick. Nor did they even want to deal with those healthy people who came out of a sick person's house, and they said to them, "He is stupefied, do not speak to him," saying further, "He has it because there is a bubo in his house." They call this swelling a bubo. Many died unseen, so they remained in their beds until they stank, and the neighbors, if there were any, having smelled the stench, placed them in a shroud and sent them for burial. Their house remained open, and yet there was no one daring enough to touch anything, because it seemed that things remained poisoned, and that whoever used them picked up the illness. At every church, or at most of them, they dug deep trenches, down to the waterline, wide and deep, depending on how large the parish was. And those who were responsible for the dead carried them on their backs in the night in which they died and threw them into the ditch. Or else they paid a high price to those who would do it for them. The next morning, if there were many bodies in the trench, they covered them over with dirt, and then more bodies were put on top of that, with a little more dirt over those. They put layer on layer, just as one puts layers of cheese in a lasagna. The Becciamorti, literally vultures, who provided their service, were paid such a high price that many were actually enriched by it. Many died from carrying away the dead, some rich, some after earning just a little. But the high prices continued. Servants, or those who took care of the ill, charged from 1 to 3 florins per day, and the cost of things grew. The things that the sick ate, sweetmeats and sugar, seemed priceless. Sugar costs from 3 to 8 florins per pound, and other confections cost similarly. Capons and other poultry were expensive, and eggs cost between 12 and 24 pence each. And he was blessed who could find 3 per day, even if he searched the entire city. Finding wax was miraculous. A pound of wax would have gone up more than a florin if there had not been a stop put by the communal government to the vain ostentation that the Florentines always make over funerals. Thus it was ordered that no more than 2 large candles could be carried in any funeral. Churches had no more than a single bier, which usually was not sufficient. Spice dealers and Becciamorti sold biers, burial pals, and cushions at very high prices. Dressing in expensive woolen cloth, as is customary in mourning the dead, that is, in a long cloak, with a mantle and veil that used to cost the women 3 florins, climbed in price to 30 florins, and would have climbed to 100 florins had the custom of dressing in expensive clothing not been changed. The rich dressed in modest woolens. Those not rich sewed clothes in linen. Benches on which the dead were placed cost like the heavens, and still the benches were only 1/100th of those needed. Priests were not able to ring any bells, as they would have liked. Concerning that, the government issued ordinances discouraging the sound of bells, sale of burial benches, and limiting expenses. They could not sound bells, sell benches, nor cry out announcements, because the sick hated to hear this, and it discouraged the healthy as well. Priests and friars went to serve the rich in great multitudes, and they were paid such high prices that they all got rich, and therefore the authorities ordered that one could not have more than a prescribed number of clerics in the local parish church, and the prescribed number of friars was 6, all fruits with a nut at the center like unripe plums and unhusked almonds, fresh broad beans, figs, and every useless and unhealthy fruit were forbidden entrance to the city. Many processions, including those with relics and the painted tablet of Santa Maria Impruneda, went through the city crying our mercy and praying, and then they came to a stop in the piazza of the Priors. There they made peace concerning important controversies, injuries, and deaths. This pestilence was a matter of such great discouragement and fear that men gathered together in order to take some comfort in dining together. And each evening one of them provided dinner to 10 companions, and the next evening they planned to eat with one of the others. And sometimes, if they planned to eat with a certain one who had no meal prepared because he was sick, or if the host had made dinner for the 10, 2 or 3 were missing, some fled to villas, other to villages, in order to get a change of air. Where there had been no pestilence, there they carried it. If it was already there, they caused it to increase. None of the guilds in Florence was working. All the shops were shut, taverns closed. Only the apothecaries and churches remained open. If you went outside, you found almost no one, and many good and rich men were carried from home to church on a pall by 4 becciamorti, and one tonsured clerk who carried the cross. Each of them wanted a florin. This mortality enriched apothecaries, doctors, poultry vendors, becciamorti and greengrocers, who sold all sorts of poultices of mallow, nettles, mercury, and other herbs necessary to draw off the infirmity. And it was those who made these poultices who made a lot of money. Wool workers and vendors of remnants of cloth who found themselves in possession of cloths after the death of the entrepreneur for whom they were working, sold it to whoever asked for it. When the mortality ended, those who found themselves with cloth of any kind, or with raw materials for making cloth, was enriched. But many found, who actually owned cloths being possessed by the workers, found it to be moth-eaten, ruined or lost by the weavers. Large quantities of raw and processed wool were lost throughout the city and countryside. The pestilence began in March, as was said, and ended in September of 1348. And people began to return to look after their houses and possessions. And there were so many houses full of goods without a master that it was stupefying. Then those who would inherit these goods began to appear, and such it was by those who had nothing found themselves rich with what did not seem to be theirs, and they were unseemly because of it. Women and men began to dress ostentatiously. How many of the dead died because of the mortality of the year of Christ, 1348? Now it was ordered by the bishop and the lords of the city government that they should formally inquire as to how many died in Florence. When it was seen at the beginning of October that no more persons were dying of the pestilence, they found that among males, females, children, and adults, 96,000 died between March and October. How they passed ordinances concerning many things in Florence. In the said year, when the mortality stopped, women and men in Florence were unmindful of traditional modest clothing, their dress. Ordinances were passed concerning this, giving the authority to the judge of Gracia to enforce these ordinances. The tailors made such boundless demands for payment that they could not be satisfied. Authority was granted to the judge that he should handle all matters himself. Servants were so unhappy about the very high prices they paid that it was necessary to make great efforts to restrain the price rises. The workers on the land in the countryside wanted rent contracts, such that you could say all the harvest would be theirs. And they learned to demand oxen from the landlord, but at the landlord's risk and liability for any harm done to the animal. And then they helped others for the pay by the job or by the day. And they also learned to deny liability for loans and rental payments. Concerning this, serious ordinances were instituted, and hiring laborers became much more expensive. You could say that the farms were theirs, and they wanted the oxen, seed, loans, quickly, and on good terms. It was necessary to put a brake on weddings as well, because when they gathered for the betrothal, Each party brought too many people in order to increase the pomp. And thus, the wedding was made up of so many trappings. How many days were necessary, and how many women took part in a woman's wedding? And they passed many other ordinances concerning these issues. End of the account. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to do another video on the general, how can I say, the ordinances that were passed in different cities. Once again, a primary source reading legal documents with a bit of extra information about the plague. But first, I am going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters. That is Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, and Christine. Thank you all so much for your support. And as usual, you know where to find me. I'll be right here, same time, same place, whenever you need me, right here on YouTube. Let's learn something new tomorrow again, shall we? Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all. And for God's sake, wash your hands.